Hey, friends and clients. I am Jennifer Walker Gates with JLW Immigration Law Group. I am an immigration attorney, and I'm here with my colleague, Diego Nuñez, also an immigration attorney with JLW Immigration Law Group. How you doing, Diego?
Good, Jennifer. How's it going?
Good, good. Thank you for being here today. We have been asked to share our experience with adjustment of status today. This has been a question that we've been getting a lot recently, and seeing a lot on our YouTube channel. People asking about adjustment of status and how it works, and kind of what to expect when you are applying for adjustment of status. So, obviously, for those like millions of people who are going through that process, having an overview and a general idea about what to expect would be really helpful. So I want us to provide that for them. But after we kind of talk about the generic case, I would love to have you share some of your experience about what are some common pitfalls and some things that can happen in the adjustment of status process that can cause it to slow down, or go off the rails in some way. So, are you ready to talk about adjustment of status?
I'm ready.
Awesome. So, what's the first step when you are going to apply for adjustment of status? Let's assume you already know that you're eligible. You already know that that you are allowed to apply, and you probably, you qualify, assuming everything goes well through your process. What's the first thing you do?
All right, so let's assume that the clients have hired us, and so they're being represented, so they're doing it through an attorney. Um,
Okay.
and so if when the individuals already know that they can do it, or they've already hired the attorney to do it, well, the first thing is the actual filing of the application, and if it's through marriage through a U.S. citizen, then it is showing that you're eligible to do it through that process. Now, we're not going to go into all the different, things that you have to do in order to apply, but let's say that you qualify to apply for the adjustment of status, and you provide all the required evidence. When that case is ready for filing, you're going to have to pay those government fees, and it's filed with USCIS, and it's sent to the lockbox. Um, Once that case gets there, it usually takes about 4 weeks to get the notices, the receipt notices saying that they received everything. And in those applications, generally, you're applying um, the immigrant petition, the I-130, the adjustment of status application, the work permit application, and advanced parole. So you're going to get all those notices. And again, we generally see that taking about 4 weeks. So that's the first step.
All right. So, file the application and you get all the notices in the mail. Then what happens after that?
All right. So then after you get the notices in the mail, you're going to get what is called the ASC, or Application Support Center, appointment notice. And that is where they're going to take your fingerprints and your biometrics. So they're going to take a photo of you. They're probably going to, and they're going to ask you to complete this short questionnaire, which is information that they're going to use to run background checks. But it is also information that is going to be used to identify you at the time of your interview. So the fingerprints are taken, your photo, and then background information. They may, which will ask about maybe your maiden name, other names used, if you've had a name change, your current name, and all that stuff. That is then, you get usually a 2 week notice from the appointment, to the appointment notice to the actual appointment. And we always tell our clients, make sure to go to that appointment, because it can be difficult to reschedule. So once you get that appointment notice, notify your employer, and make time to go there. It's usually not very long, um, but because where depending on where you live, it may take a while to get there. So don't miss it.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm hearing you say step one, file the application, get the receipt notices.
Right.
Step two is go to your biometrics appointment.
That's right.
Yep. All right. Then what happens typically after the biometrics appointment?
All right. Well, then we wait. And if immigration is satisfied with everything that you've provided and it looks like you qualify for the benefit, then hopefully you get your work permit. And I just looked at the processing times for the National Benefits Center, and it's saying that it's taking 17 months in general to process the work permit. Now that is way outside of the processing times that I'm seeing for my clients. I think our clients are getting those work permits about 7 or 8 months into the adjustment application case. However, let's say that they think that something is missing, or that maybe your income does not, your petitioner's income does not qualify or isn't high enough, or maybe there's not enough evidence to support what you're saying your income is. Then it's possible, likely, that you're going to get a request for additional evidence. And that will give you usually 87 days to respond from the date of the notice. And that's the maximum amount that immigration is going to be able to give you. So, for example, I've had issues where people are getting income that is non-taxable, like maybe they're U.S. Military veterans, or maybe they're getting child support or spousal support. And so sometimes it just requires an extra explanation, even if you've already provided it before. So don't get mad.
Yeah, that's very common.
Right.
Maybe an RFE could be step 4. So steps 3 and 4 are very frustrating, I think, for a lot of people going through this process, like waiting for the processing times. That's unpleasant and anxiety provoking. Then if you get a request for evidence, it's also anxiety provoking. Not the most fun steps of the process, but very common for USCIS. This just happened today. Yesterday, actually, in the mail in the afternoon, I was just visiting with a client this morning about a request for evidence we got for photo ID in a case where we submitted a copy of the passport. If that isn't a photo ID, then I don't know what is. But it's very, very common for USCIS to ask for documents that have already been submitted. It doesn't mean something's wrong with the case. Sometimes officers do that when they are behind on their work and they need to have a reason why they haven't hit their quota. If they have an RFE, a certain number of RFEs out, it excuses them from having to hit their numbers. And so that's probably not a super, I don't know how common that is, frankly. That could be happening all the time, or it could be not that common. But we definitely see lots of RFEs where we've already submitted stuff. So if that happens, don't panic.
Right. And then also, I think something to keep in mind is that, remember, this is a gigantic agency with thousands of applications and millions of documents being processed. So that
That's right.
If 1 or 2 or 3 things get misplaced, I mean, it's bound to happen. So it's just, but it's not fatal to the case. You respond in time, you're going to be in good shape.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. They're dealing with like billions of bits of data every single day. So, and there's lots of humans involved. So there's bound to be mistakes. Okay. So steps 3 and 4, blah, wait, maybe get an RFE. And then what happens at step 5, Diego?
All right, step 5, the interview. And
oh, wait, what about work and travel permit?
Oh, but well, I did mention if you don't get an RFE, then they would issue the work permit. But yes, so the work and travel permit. So one of the things that we have seen lately is that immigration is issuing the work permit separate from the advanced parole travel permit. It can be they can issue it in the same document, which is great because it's it gives you the permission to work, but it also allows you to travel outside of the country without abandoning your application. But now, again, processing times according to USCIS, 17 months. What I've seen in our cases around 7 or 8 months, but maybe it's going to start taking a little longer to process. But yes,
Yeah.
the work permits.
Ideally.
And sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
to interrupt, but also when you're applying for the first time and you haven't had a social security number in that actual work permit application, most of our clients want us to mark that they do want the social security to be issued. And so separately from the different agency, the Treasury Department, we get that social security number.
Yeah. So typically in the smooth case, you get the work and travel permit in one document plus your social security number well before the interview is scheduled. That's the best case scenario. So after that work and travel permit, then comes
the interview.
All
right. So the interview, the processing time to get the interview for me lately has run the gamut, because I had an interview yesterday for a client that she has been waiting for almost 2 years. I had a client, another client that's been waiting for 2 years that got his second interview. And then at the same time, I've had other clients that are getting their interviews in about 11 or 12 months. So it can be average. I would say maybe 11 to 16 months is probably the average. And then, so the day of the interview, let's just assume that we're going to San Antonio. Before the interview, we're going to prep you. So let's say that Jennifer is your attorney. She's going to go over your application with you. She's going to ask if there has been anything that's changed in your case. And if so, then she's going to be able to provide documentation. For example, let's say that your client, Jennifer, traveled on her advanced parole. And so she's back, and so she has a new I-94. So that's her record of entry. So Jennifer's going to give that to the officer. And then, if everything else is good, then we're going to meet the client 15 minutes prior to the interview outside, waiting in line. They're not going to let you in. There's no exceptions. We learned that yesterday. Well, my client did. And so then you're going to go through security. So don't wear a lot of metal. My client's wife had, she had a lot of jewelry on. And so it took a while to get through security. Then you're going to go after security to check in. And that's where your biometrics come in again. So now they're going to take fingerprints. I think it's just your thumbprints and your index fingers. And then they're going to take your photo, and they're going to see if you match as the person that went to that biometrics appointment. Everything is good. They're going to give you this little ticket, and K54, let's say, is the number that you get. And they're going to staple it onto your interview notice, and you're going to wait. And yesterday we waited an hour for our interview. The week before that, I waited an hour and a half. And then other times you get called in right on time. So it's great.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you want me to keep going, or if you've got any questions in between that information.
Well, I did just want to mention that the other thing that has been happening recently, much more than I had seen previously at any point in my career, is that interviews are being waived.
Right.
So a bunch of cases have been approved recently with no interview. I don't think it's smart to plan on that, especially if you're applying based on marriage. But we've even seen those approved without interview recently. And I think it's part of the USCIS effort to catch up with the backlog that was created during the pandemic, that they're waiving some of those interviews, even for newlyweds, and so
right.
That's great if that happens. I don't know that I would count on it, because it's better to be prepared than to assume that you're not going to get interviewed. But if your case does go to approval with no interview, again, no problem. That's actually great. And that's that.
Well, And the one thing I noticed, like, for example, my clients yesterday had been married for over 20 years.
Mm.
But the cases where I saw that they were getting those interviews waived, for many of them were newlyweds, and they were approving them before the 2-year anniversary of their marriage, meaning that they were getting conditional status, and they still are going to get a second bite at them, a second opportunity to investigate the marriage at the time of the removal of conditional residency. But that's a
Yeah.
whole other video.
Yeah, totally. The other types of cases that I've seen get interviews waived a lot recently are parents of U.S. citizens. So for many years, pretty much every adjustment of status case that I was handling had an interview. And now it's really anyone's guess as to whether a case is going to get interviewed or not. I do know that sometimes a case will get scheduled for an interview if for no other reason than to train a new officer or something like that. So sometimes a parent will get scheduled for an interview, sometimes they won't. So it's tough to know ahead of time, but just good to be prepared for either of those eventualities.
Right.
After the interview, Diego, what happens?
Well, before we get to the decision, something you mentioned about the interview process and getting a second interview and things like that, and training. So yesterday, the interview that I went to, we did have someone being trained. And one issue that we did run into, and this has happened in the last two, is that they're converting their files and they're digitizing them. So for example, one client that had 2 interviews, the interview in August of 2023, he had the big paper file. When we went to that second interview, the officer didn't realize that it had been digitized. And she was looking for some documents from a request for evidence that we had responded to. And yesterday, because of the digitized files, they were having some issues in updating the information. So even though we maybe added the new travel date for my client, when we're ready to conclude and review the changes, the program was having glitches and it was changing answers. And they told us that that was going to delay the last security checks, and she couldn't tell us if it was, how long it would take to grant. Now, I would assume it would take only 1 day for the glitches to be resolved, but that is another issue that I wanted to mention before. But now, decision. I've had it where I am driving back to Austin and Lorena will text me that the client was approved. So from the moment that we were interviewed on our way out, we knew that it was going to be approved or that it needed to do a final check, and we get the notification, approved. Other times it may be about a couple of days, maybe a week. And then if it is approved, I've noticed that we've been getting the permanent resident cards 2 weeks later. So that's great. Sometimes there's a second request for evidence. Now, normally those are cases with maybe bigger issues. Maybe there is a criminal arrest. Maybe there is a prior removal history or something to that effect. And they're going to request it. And they may actually sometimes even issue a notice of intent to deny. So you got to be ready for that stuff. If that happens, it doesn't normally happen in a week or two. I've noticed that normally happens about a month or after.
Yeah. And in those situations, the decision timeframe can take much longer. In my experience, those are the kinds of cases where ultimately we end up having to really throw a big fit in order to get a decision issued, because if there's like a bunch of additional work that's outside of the normal routine that an officer needs to finish in order to complete a case, sometimes it's very tempting for that file to just get stuck on a shelf and buried beneath a bunch of other stuff and not really ever dealt with. it's very easy, I think, for officers to procrastinate on dealing with those because they're kind of a headache. So those can turn into a headache for everybody. But in the best case scenario is like the one you described, where you go into your interview, everything is taken care of, everything is approvable. It's clear that the case will be approved. They do have to complete another background check. Ideally, their technology is working properly and they're able to get that done quickly, and then you get the approval right away. So that's the general overview. We do have a bunch of questions, Diego, so I want to take a minute to respond to audience questions. Richard says, what's the average wait time for a green card holder petitioning for a child that is 20 years old? So that's a different kind of case, because, Richard, in a case like that, I'm going to get rid of that decision banner. There we go. Going back to your question, Richard, in a case like that, what you're talking about is a petition that for an individual who needs to wait for their priority date to become current. So rather than looking at USCIS processing times, unless you're talking about after you've already submitted the adjustment of status, in which case the adjustment of status should be the same as anybody else's. But if you're talking about the wait times for the priority date to become current for the petition itself, that depends on the Department of State visa bulletin. And what we've seen recently is that those wait times have increased significantly. For several years in a row, the wait times for children under 21 of green card holders were current. Like you could file the petition and then immediately be ready to file for the resident status. But it's right now, I believe it's 4 to 5 years that has, it has backlogged. And so I think in a case like this, where the child is 20, ideally the petitioner could naturalize before the child turns 21, so that that petition becomes an immediate relative petition and you don't end up in that even longer category of adult children of green card holders.
Right. And then if you do naturalize before the child turns 21, then the Child Status Protection Act will solidify that the status of that child as a child, even if they turn 21 or older. And so it's a good reason to do it. There's so many reasons to become a citizen, but that's one that's a huge benefit.
Yes, and I hope that that hasn't been too confusing an answer, Richard. I know for me, like understanding the kind of intricacies of a petition versus an application for residency and the Child Status Protection Act, and when you turn 21, that what category you're in and all of that is like, it's a lot of like really technical information. So would be not a bad idea to talk to an attorney. We have seen in certain cases where if a priority date is current, so for example, if your child is 20, but your priority date is very close to being current, you can sometimes request an expedited appointment to make sure with a consulate. For example, if the child is outside the US, sometimes you can request an expedited appointment to be sure that that person doesn't turn 21 before they get their appointment and get approved for their visa. So depending on how close everything is, you may really want to talk to an attorney to get very clear about whether there are steps you can take to cut a bunch of wait time off of that petition for that child. So Lawrence in Miami, let's see. Online, yes, online, they answer the same day because it's electronic. So you're talking to think about online filing. I personally have really enjoyed online filing for the most part. It is still very glitchy and problematic for attorneys to file online, but hopefully they are making it better. I have seen improvements and I think they're going to continue. And you're right that like when you file an I-130 online, you get your receipt notice immediately. It doesn't take weeks to get your receipt notice. It happens instantaneously. However, the I-485 application for adjustment of status is still not available to be filed online. It is not one of the processes that we can file online yet. So hopefully that's in the near future, but to date, we still have to file those by U.S. Postal Service. So let's see, I married twice. I didn't fix my papers with my first wife, but they got me a social and a work permit for 2 years, then nothing else because I divorced too early. Now, 10 years later, I'm gonna get married. Okay. And then here's the question. Do I need to go to the biometrics and file the form I-765 again because I already got the social? I'm just out of status. I entered in 2014 through Miami. All right, Diego, what do you think we should tell?
Lawrence, Miami. Well, I would say, Lawrence, yes, you definitely have to go to the biometrics if they schedule you for the biometrics, because it's a new case. But there is a possibility where they will waive the appointment if they can reuse your fingerprints and your biometric data from the prior appointment. But if you do get scheduled, you got to go. There's no exception to it. If you don't go, then the case will be considered abandoned, and then you're out of luck.
Yeah. So the and the forms that you filed previously with immigration, all of those have to be filed again. One difference, though, Lawrence, might be that since you already do have your own social, you can mark on form I-765 that you, and on form I-485. I think both of those forms now ask if you want a new social security number or new social security card. You can say no on that. They don't need to issue you a new social security number. Once you get a social security number, that one is yours for life, unless someone steals it and uses your identity for bad stuff, in which case you might want to get a new social security number. We have seen that happen too many times, unfortunately. But I've got a social and work permit. I pay taxes 10 years nonstop, and I came here with a plain B2 visa. Okay, so if you are married again to another U.S. citizen and that person is willing and able to sponsor you for your residency, it sounds like you should be eligible. There may be some questions about that prior marriage and that prior application. They're going to want to vet the case to make sure that your current marriage is valid. So it will be important and helpful to submit a lot of evidence that this is a good faith marriage, not for immigration purposes, and be ready to answer questions about the prior marriage and whether that one was for immigration purposes. So that is common. It doesn't mean anything's wrong or bad with the case, but it is good to be prepared for those kinds of questions. Don't you think, Diego?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say if you haven't, definitely go and speak with an attorney. This is the kind of stuff that, yes, it is common, but it also is there are issues that they're going to investigate. And you just want to make sure that everything is done properly so that it doesn't create a bigger problem at a later point.
Yeah. I think that our video on our channel about preparing for the I-485 interview addresses very carefully the kinds of questions and issues and circumstances that arise in cases where someone has perhaps had an old application that they didn't follow through on, or if there are any doubts or questions about the good faith nature of the marriage. Diego and I talk a lot in that video about the way that the officers handle those kinds of interviews and how to be well prepared for those kinds of interviews if you do have any kind of situation like that in your history. So I think that's all the questions for now. Diego, I wanted to go back to what we were talking about before we started today, your interview yesterday, and the kind of issue that came up there. I think it touches well on the question about the Social Security and whether you need a new Social Security card or not. And there are very limited circumstances where you might need one, but it sounds like y'all might have run into one yesterday.
Right. So at the interview yesterday, and we, the case that we have is very clean cut. There's no criminal history. Our client is eligible. She's married to a U.S. citizen. Um, so we wonder why it was taking so long. Well, when we got in, the officer said, "Hey, I'm going to be asking a lot about previously used names because your client is showing to have 25 aliases. So 25 different names, different variations. And I mean, so you've got, she's got a first name, middle name, and 2 last names. Plus she's married. Well, in the end, long story short, it turns out that her husband's pickup truck was stolen in Austin, and it was used to smuggle people at the border. It was seized by the government. But before that even happened, it looks like possibly his wife's identification was in the truck, and one of the individuals going back and forth, and we're talking about 1999, was using her identity.
Oh,
And so that, let's say that my client would have been going back and forth, 1999, that would have made her ineligible. That would have been kaput for the case. And so anyway, she did a great job, and I we just realized later, it was like, oh, this was a whole, a completely different situation where her identity was stolen.
wow.
So these kind of things do happen, where and we were not aware of that. She was not aware of it. She thought she lost her ID. She didn't think that her ID was stolen. So it was
Wow.
an interesting
That
ending.
is fascinating.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone was surprised to hear that she had 25 aliases. That's never a fun experience to go into an interview with a
Right.
client and told something like that. I've had too many interviews where I learned for the first time that my client had a criminal history or
Yeah.
we have one more question here. Dominique says, I applied I-130 petition while waiting for approval. How to extend my 6-month visa? Okay, so I think the question is about extending perhaps a non-immigrant tourist visa while waiting for an I-130 petition. And what do you want to say about that, Diego?
Well, okay. So I would say, look, in general, you have to talk about these details. We can't do it in a public forum directly for you. In general, though, when you've got a petition pending or you have filed an I-130 petition, that is based, and you're in the United States, you're saying to the government, I intend to become an immigrant, to immigrate to the United States. And if you've got a certain kind of non-immigrant status, let's say that you're here on an H-2A or H-2B visa, where there is only the intent to be here on a temporary basis, or if you're here on a B1 or B2, where your intent is, you're a visitor and it's temporary. Well, if you're trying to extend that, you're saying, oh, my intent is to be here temporarily, but then the I-130 petition, well, my intent is to live here permanently. And so then those two intents are clashing with one another, and it's going to raise red flags. So now there are some people that may have a status that provides both intents. This is a kind of answer that, this is the kind of question that should be answered in a private, confidential consultation.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there are a lot of details that we would want to know about in order to be able to correctly and properly advise a client who had a situation where they had a temporary visa they wanted to extend while also filing an I-130 for, ultimately, ideally for permanent status in the US. And so you have, having a temporary and a permanent status application pending at the same time can be really problematic depending on which categories they're in. If it is kind of like the most common sort of situation I see, and what I think may be going on here, which is someone came in on a tourist visa and they want to extend it because they want to have lawful status while their other case is working its way through. It's very, noble intentions. People want to maintain their lawful status and make sure their visa and their paperwork is in order. They don't want to let it expire. However, the weird way that the immigration law works in the United States means that you can't really apply for a tourist visa and a permanent resident visa at the same time. And if your tourist visa expires, depending on what category you're in, if you have a U.S. citizen spouse, having your tourist visa expire isn't going to actually make you ineligible for your residency. And in fact, it creates fewer complications to just let it expire. Now, there are potential issues. What's that?
Well, depending on the situation, though,
yeah.
like that's and for example, in filing it, the thing that you want to avoid is to be accused of misrepresentation.
Yeah.
And create another roadblock on your way to try to obtain permanent residence. And so
yeah, so that's the other potential issue that I think we both see here, Dominique, is that if you enter on a tourist visa and before it expires, you're already applying for permanent resident status, there could be a question about what you actually intended to do with your tourist visa when you came into the US. So I've seen this before where sometimes officers are very kind of like, you know what, things happen, plans change, people get married, they fall in love, they meet people, they change their mind, and they don't make you, answer a bunch of questions and like file a waiver. And I've seen the opposite with an officer who will be like, you clearly lied when you came in with your tourist visa, when you said you were just coming to visit, and then you got married and filed for your residency. You have to file a waiver, and they won't listen to any reason about it. So in those cases, it's really important to be ready for that possibility. And so that's why we would say, schedule an appointment, if not with us, then with another trusted immigration attorney, just to understand very clearly how you're going to respond in different kinds of scenarios at the point where your interview happens, assuming you're going to get one. So it is time for us to call it a day. This has been a really good discussion. Thank you so much, Diego, for being here. For anyone who wants to reach out to us, our website and phone number are at the bottom of the screen. Call us at 512-633-1785. Our team will be happy to help you schedule an appointment, or go to jlw.law and click on the button to schedule with me or Diego or any of the attorneys in our firm. It is our honor and our passion to help people get to the finish line and successfully with their immigration cases. And we would be happy to speak with anyone about their case, give you really honest, straightforward advice about how to be successful, and help you get there if that's what you need. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Anything else, Diego, before we sign off?
Nothing else. Just have a great weekend.
Thank you. Yes, everyone stay safe. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again next week.
See ya.